Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss the news today that a constituency poll in the only seat UKIP ever won in a general election has shown that if Nigel Farage stood as a candidate for Reform UK, he could win the seat this year. So this calls for two big questions to be answered. How reliable is the poll? And would Nigel Farage actually want to stand? Because there are multiple reasons which might make him hesitant. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So the Sunday Times has published the results of a poll carried out by Survation. It was conducted in Clacton in Essex in 2015, the year when UKIP won 14% of the vote. Despite Cameron caving into the UKIP entryists and his party, UKIP basically trebled their vote share that year. But the only seat they actually won was Clacton. Now, it's going to be a slightly different Clacton because the boundaries are changing. But ultimately this area. Even then, it was won by a former Conservative MP who defected. So without that defection, it may still have been one the Conservatives would have retained anyway. However, it's reasonable to describe the area as probably the best target for another Brexity type challenge. And a poll from Survation has concluded that if Nigel Farage stood as a candidate for Reform UK, he would be a big enough draw to win the seat. So the first big question is, how reliable is the poll? Well, the main alarm bell comes from it's not a conclusive alarm bell, but the main alarm bell comes from the news that the poll was not commissioned by the Sunday Times, even though they're reporting on it, but by Aaron Banks, a pro-Brexit associate of Farage, who has presumably commissioned this poll in order to persuade Nigel Farage to stand. Now, it's worth bearing something in mind when it comes to professional polling companies. There are times when the client absolutely, genuinely wants to know what a group of people think about a particular thing, right? And the pollster will then do their best to produce accurate results. That's what we expect is the work of a pollster. But there are times when what the client wants is for the pollster to come up with some way of claiming that a particular group of people think a particular way, and the pollster will do that as well. So the customer is always right. So it's being commissioned by Banks is a bit of a red flag, but it doesn't mean the poll is invalid. Now, someone from Survation did post up the data tables for analysis. It contains their methodology, full questions and results. So full transparency here. That's fine. That's great. So you look at the results are interesting. In fact, there are a few points of interest. So let's go over them. The first is that with a generic Reform UK candidate, the party would likely finish in third place behind Labour, with the Conservatives winning. So that seat at the moment isn't all that bothered about voting Reform UK. The suggestion is they'd get a much higher share of the vote than they'd expect in many seats around the country, but it's still third place. It's the inclusion of Nigel Farage as the candidate which would more than double the share of the vote and leapfrog them over both Labour and the Conservatives. Now, if this is the case, it makes you wonder about the wisdom of Rishi Sunak speaking of Nigel Farage as a credible Conservative last autumn. He was effectively telling Conservative voters that it would be all right to vote for him. Oh yeah, he's a decent chap. We'd absolutely have him in the party. They absolutely would not have him in the party because apparently party chair Greg Hands at the time said no. But Rishi Sunak was talking as if, at some point in the future, yeah, they'd absolutely accept him. Or the hint was that they would. So I would suggest, again, not attacking Farage or Reform UK, who are their political opponents, is not really going to work out well for the Tories here. The second point of interest is that it shows that if Farage stood, he would not only reduce the Conservative vote share, but Labour's as well. Now, that coupled with the fact that Labour are projected to get 30% of the vote without Farage standing in what is a very, very, very Tory area, would suggest there's a strong desire to abandon the Tories in this area, whether it be by voting tactically for someone else or staying at home. And much of this can be explained. If you look at the breakdown, it shows that double the number of Leave voters would support Reform UK if Farage was standing compared with the current candidate. And many of those Leave voters are currently preparing to vote Labour. So that explains quite a big chunk of Labour's vote loss in this poll. But just the idea that without Farage, Labour could actually come close to the Conservatives, that's quite interesting. I mean, seriously, this is one of the safest seats the Tories have. if it looks like one of the very safest, if it looks like there could be a serious challenge hit from anyone, but especially Labour, I mean, that would set the cat amongst the Tory pigeons. And the breakdown shows that with Farage as the candidate, 16% of 2019 Labour voters would back Reform UK, compared to 5% if the currently assumed Reform candidate Anthony Mack was standing. So, you would say that is the big draw of Nigel Farage. Weirdly, though, it would somehow boost the number of 2019 Labour voters who would vote Lib Dem, by a little bit, admittedly, and savagely cut the number of 2019 Lib Dem voters who are currently saying they'd vote Labour. That's the weirdest result for me. I mean, if you're looking at the validity of poll or reliability of poll, you do try and look for little markers, little results that don't really make sense. And that one's a big, weird one for me. Because the poll is, I mean, there could be an explanation. But the poll is suggesting that a large proportion of 2019 Lib Dem voters in the seat will vote Labour this year. Now, we're seeing that pattern across a lot of seats around the country that are between the Labour and the Conservatives. Again, it's the rise of tactical voting this year, right? They're voting tactically. They're not flipping from the Lib Dems as such. They're just voting tactically. But what this poll is saying is, so if Nigel Farage stands for Reform UK, a massive number of those Lib Dem, presumably tactical voters for Labour, are going to switch away from Labour and transfer to another candidate. You know, you look at they're not going from Labour to Reform UK, because that'd be mad anyway. They're not even going back to the Lib Dems. It's going to other. Really bizarre, that. Really bizarre. I would expect that the anti-Brexit and anti-Tory vote would increasingly rally around Labour at the prospect of having Farage representing them. Yet we see that Farage standing not only drains former Lib Dem votes away from Labour, but former Remain votes as well. It's like Farage standing makes Lib Dem and Remain voters more Brexity somehow. But anyway, final point on analysis would just be to mention that constituency polling for new boundaries is extra tricky. That is because you've got to weight your sample towards people most likely to vote. You base that largely on past voting behaviour. It's always harder for like smaller areas. So an individual constituency is always a little tricky. But also, that having to base it on past voting behaviour, because this constituency doesn't technically exist until the election, the past voting behaviour is based on a mishmash of different constituencies. So it is trickier. So you'll get a greater than usual margin for error here. But that's my thoughts on reliability analysis. If we take it as read that the poll is reasonably reliable, because even taking errors into account, it's suggesting that Farage would be a very strong draw in this constituency. So would he do it? Well, I can think of reasons why Nigel Farage would not wish to stand in this seat. The first is that he's ultimately a grifter. Yes, he has genuinely very strong political views, and in theory, I'm sure he'd love to be an MP. But he'd like to be a pirate MP, I think, one who can just swan in and out. And there are MPs who basically do that. They don't really turn up to Parliament. They just do what they like. He'd like that. He'd like to be able to get the benefits of being an MP without the responsibilities. But being an MP might impede his other earnings potential, especially with Labour's proposed rules on second jobs. Now, we still don't know the exact details of that. So, for example, would he still be allowed to do his media work? If not, that'll be some money out the window. He would also face greater scrutiny for his activities, particularly where expenses are concerned. Would he really fancy the heat with a Labour government in town determined to clean up politics? The second is the same reason why I've expressed doubt that he'd even want to lead Reform UK if the election ends up being in autumn. I don't think he wants to miss the chance to earn the big bucks on the Trump campaign tour later this year. Well, this reasoning counts double if he's going to be an actual candidate. Third would be his ego. He's already attempted to stand for Parliament 7 times and lost 7 times. On the last occasion, he finished behind a man dressed as a dolphin, and therefore seemed to lose the taste for parliamentary elections after that. What we have here is a poll saying he would win hands down if he stood. So it's almost like if he doesn't stand, he can always go, oh yeah, I would have won it. I would have totally won it. Yeah. The poll says so, you know. Huge boost to his ego that would be shattered if he actually stood and lost. Because even if this poll is reliable right now, consider the campaign. Like I keep saying, if campaigns didn't work, groups wouldn't spend so much money on them. Reform UK are currently crowdfunding for the £500 deposit they need for their candidate in the North East mayoral election this spring. Now, if they're having to beg for a few quid for the deposit, they're not exactly flush with funds. And yes, I know they'll be saving up for the general election and for winnable seats. I get that. But if they're scrimping to the point where they can't afford deposits without extra funds, it doesn't suggest that they have much of a war chest. They may be reliant on the free publicity provided by a self-interested media. In which case, the more professional campaigns of the Conservatives and Labour could soon change these polling figures for the election itself. Basically, despite this poll, which is of dubious reliability anyway, Farage isn't guaranteed to win. If he loses in a seat that UKIP won at a key moment in Brexit's future, when the Tories' reputation is in the toilet, then his reputation takes a knock. And it will be made all the worse now that a poll shows that he would win and win comfortably. So that would be like defeat from the jaws of victory. Arguably, the poll makes him more hesitant to stand because it raises the stakes. And fourth, so let's say he did win, and let's say he could carry on with his main grifting work or could generate an alternative income in line with parliamentary rules. Would he really want to? Like, what would he do? I mean, he'd stand up now and then, moan about something, then sit down and be roundly ignored for another few months before he can speak again. And if he failed to attend Parliament like he did the EU Parliament, like he got away with that because he was like trying to bring it down from the inside, even though he never really went there. But his voters supported that. You know, all that talk of wanting decisions made in Britain. Well, he'd have to turn up to Parliament then, wouldn't he? He'd have to turn up and help make those decisions. He'd have to turn up. He'd have to be part of a select committee. He'd have to hold people to account. He'd have to do some work. And for him, work, full-time-ish work, that is not even generating much money. He's going to be doing it for like peanuts as far as he's concerned. Peanuts. So we shall see. I think he will enjoy the constant focus on him. I think he'll enjoy the speculation. He'll enjoy people talking about him as a political game changer, because that's what this poll says. It's like, oh, Reform UK, third place. Oh, you're decent result. Oh, but Nigel Farage would basically double their share of the vote. Oh, he'll love it. But I suspect he'll also be aware of the more practical downsides to standing. But we will see. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.